The Pikmin series, up until recently, seems to have been ritually punished. The first 3 games sold on Nintendo's worst-selling consoles, not named the Virtual Boy. On top of that, they are RTS games on a console, a genre and platform combination that's alienating for RTS fans and confusing for console fans. There's also the lack of representation of the games outside of the occasional plush. Despite this, it's also one of the franchises I feel is the most Nintendo. When tackling these established genres, the company seems to find a way to make it their own. Splatoon has a unique take on the shooting genre. Mario sports games have a unique flair from other bog-standard sports games, and Nintendo's take on fighting games basically fork the genre entirely. Pikmin is the biggest example of this, being something within the RTS genre, but still its own thing which seems to defy categorization. To quote Brown Bear's own retrospective on the first game, I lean towards the notion that the genreification of Pikmin is downstream of the original concept. That's what makes Pikmin wholly unique in its genre. It's also what makes Pikmin really hard to get into. I've already talked a lot about my own inexperience with RTS as a genre in a previous video, but Pikmin's unique blend of its own ideas also put me off. Everything from the in-game time limit, my inability to properly control my Pikmin, to the game's difficulty all pushed me away from the original GameCube launch title. I only came back to it because I wanted footage for that previous video. Well, I got my footage along with a new obsession. All of the hurdles I've mentioned ended up being overblown in my mind or turned into my favorite aspects of the game. Let's dive into it, and hopefully by the end, you'll understand why I think that way. One of the biggest swings that Pikmin takes is its game-long time limit. While I'm not unfamiliar with mechanics like these, I love Majora's Mask after all, I think that Pikmin's specific framing of the issue is off-putting. In a game like Majora's Mask, there's a progression that happens outside of the normal 3-day loop you participate in, meaning that you don't feel a ton of pressure to get everything done within a single cycle. I know that some people play that way, trying to get the most out of every single cycle in the game, but it's honestly easier to reset the cycle regularly after finishing large tasks. In Pikmin though, you get one cycle, and if you're not grabbing a ship part every day, you're behind. That looming consequence makes the whole game feel tense in a way that I was not used to. You also have only so much time to get things done. For American players, you only have 13.5 minutes per day to get ship parts, add Pikmin to your army, and fight enemies. As a result, the time limit feels restraining. As I played the game though, I noticed how easy it was to get a ship part every day, and even get 2 most days near the end. The maps are relatively small enough, and many of the later ones have such a large number of ship parts that it's fairly easy to plan out your day after the first landing, and gather at least 2 or 3 ship parts depending on how well you can play the game. Some players are able to actually beat the game in only 6 days. While I'm not that good, it goes to show how much you can get done in an in-game day. I slowly understood my own limitations, and focused on getting as much done as possible, rather than keeping my focus on the remaining time left. The game never required me to be perfect. While this may have been a good enough answer for the logical part of my brain, I also wanted to mention that I didn't tolerate the time limit near the end. I enjoyed it. One of the things that the later Pikmin games look to struggle with is recreating the atmosphere and tone of the first game. The second and fourth games don't have hard time limits, and the third game's time limit changes with how much you've gathered, so good players end up not feeling the limit at all anyway. This game provides a clear timetable and doesn't relent on it. There is no getting out of it. You either get all of the ship parts, you launch with only the necessary ship parts, or Olimar dies. This gives each ship log more weight on that very first playthrough. Some of Olimar's logs are even frustrated with his wife and his lack of prep work. I felt that before. Frustrated and locked in a position that I couldn't move out of, and had to trudge through. Yet, I also read some of the joy that Olimar had in this new place. There is adventure even in this dark situation, as Olimar notes all the creatures and the way that the Pikmin interact with the environment with a curious glee. As though the game is saying that he doesn't have to let the situation take away his joy and curiosity. This dynamic that the game has, where Olimar is both fighting for his life and learning how to better understand and manipulate the environment, is intriguing to watch as a viewer. I ended up feeling really connected to Olimar throughout my playthrough, in spite of the fact that the ship logs were usually no longer than a single paragraph. This is a dynamic that I don't think works as well if you were to remove the time limit and lower the stakes of the situation. It's also why the NPCs in Majora's Mask work so well. Each of them is facing total obliteration. Seeing how people react to that is the most interesting part about NPC interaction in that game. Similarly, seeing Olimar struggle against time would hardly be felt if the player were in control of that time limit. Everything I previously said applies really well on a first playthrough, when I had the least information about the world, Olimar, and the Pikmin. Yet, on subsequent playthroughs, the day limit also puts in the work to make the game seem more interesting. You see, after that first playthrough, I got a total of the number of Pikmin I created, the number defeated, and how many days it took. This is an implicit invitation to do the best in all categories, starting with getting the total number of days lower. My first playthrough took about 23 in-game days. This isn't a particularly impressive number, but honestly I was just happy I got all 30 ship parts. Later playthroughs had me beat the game in only 18 days, and my recorded playthrough beat it in 14. This measure of my own progress in the game is shown through this end screen when I saw there was space for up to 5 playthroughs. This motivates me to do more playthroughs of Pikmin, and it had me fall in love with how good it feels to get a hang of the Pikmin AI and the multitasking you often have to do in the game. I eventually got into the habit of looking at the map at the start of the day, making a plan, and then executing on that plan as swiftly as possible. I had a couple of plans go poorly, but when I knew the plan was working perfectly, it was really the best feeling in the world. This is later referred to in the franchise as Dendori, but I think this is just a really simple example of RTS multitasking. I managed my resources, which in this case were the Pikmin, I explored the map, and I got as many objectives as I could without losing track of my army. This is often why I'm surprised when other people are surprised that Pikmin is an RTS. It fits all of the same aspects that the genre is known for. The only difference is that you only have one camera that you can't snap anywhere. Also, unlike other RTS games, the Pikmin are largely useless on their own. But in any case, the days being tracked helps sell the enjoyable process of planning and multitasking in the game. It's also just a fun way to measure your own skill in the game. Overall, even though the time limit can feel really restrictive, the game actually puts a ton of work into making the time limit feel less restrictive and more interesting. It's pretty generous, all things considered, it's built into the story of the game, and it helps repeat playthroughs feel really fun. This brings a larger discussion of how time limits in general seem to build more meaningful gameplay experiences, in spite of them being largely unpopular. I'll leave that discussion to Rasputin. For me, though, the Pikmin time limit went from something that put me off the game to one of my favorite parts of the experience. One of the biggest hurdles I had to cross in my own journey to understand the RTS genre was controlling my units and moving them around a map. The whole thing is not intuitive if you're used to games where you control a single character and move them around the map. This is something I failed to mention in my Warcraft 3 video, but I think it's important here with Pikmin. The game wants to have it both ways, it seems. You're always in control of Olimar, who's both a character and the focal point on the screen, rather than playing the part of some omniscient camera who can view the whole playing field equally at all times. You need to control a character who has a physical presence on the map. You can feel this in basically every aspect of Pikmin's design. Areas like the Forest Navel have tons of special ways for Olimar to navigate due to the player not being able to freely move him to wherever they need to look. This goes double for setting Pikmin on a task and trying to do something else at the same time. Something as simple as managing a fight while checking on your buildings is a big ask in Pikmin. There's also the matter of the controller itself. Sure, I like the GameCube controller, but an RTS game that focuses on its use is going to feel like an inherently less interesting experience. You just don't have the buttons for the normal level of granularity you would expect. This is all on top of the jank that they removed in later games. Pikmin tripping, the variable throw speed of Pikmin since they have to be close enough to Olimar to count, and the fact that you can't control which Pikmin you're about to throw in any direct way. This makes all of the controls extremely frustrating when you're first learning how the game works. Yeah, I find myself being okay with it at this point in my journey. I won't push aside that it's frustrating to start with, but eventually I calmed down and actually looked at the situation I was in and what the game was expecting of me. It was in taking a slower assessment of things that I realized that, although I'd been struggling a bit with these aspects of the controls, I would eventually get used to it. Pikmin tripped, sure, but it's not like one Pikmin was going to push me to the brink of collapse. I'm certain if I was a speedrunner I'd feel differently about that, but as a casual player who enjoys getting better at the game, I found that tripping was a minor inconvenience and made the act of moving from place to place more interesting than just watching Olimar's walk cycle. The game also rewarded me for thinking ahead with tactical decisions. There's a ship part in the Forest Navel that practically requires all 3 Pikmin types to get. The main enemies and hazards they'll run into are these fire spouts and the fiery blowhogs lounging around the area, which red Pikmin are exclusively immune to. Yet I knew this and had enough red Pikmin in my army that I could set them on it and then move on to other ship parts. This process of learning how the game's maps work and working around some of the limited controls that the game provides is actually part of the fun of the game. Once you learn to work within its limitations, it doesn't feel that frustrating to play. I ended the game feeling significantly more confident in my ability to move Pikmin, while also never feeling like the little guys had no real life in them. Each of their little quirks are still interesting to me, and I felt that I was controlling a real living group rather than commanding my little robots to take points and win me objectives. Getting used to it wasn't easy, but it also wasn't as hard as I thought it would be, which makes me think that many of these things were probably overblown by my initial impressions. Something Stranger also helped a ton. I found some ways to use the jank in my favor. I mentioned earlier that Pikmin had to be close to Olimar for him to throw them. This results in a lowered throwing speed compared to later entries. However, it's possible to use the swarm function to surround Olimar in viable throwing Pikmin, which means he can start throwing them as fast as the player can push the button. Despite this technically being an exploit, I found it on my first playthrough. It gives a really good strategy for certain enemies where throwing as many Pikmin as possible is the quickest way to defeat them. Sure, the game didn't provide that option, but it gave me a lot more confidence when trying to take down certain enemies or get a ton of Pikmin on a ledge very quickly. This technique helped maneuvering Pikmin seem less tedious and allowed me better control of my army when I needed them the most. The last thing that helped me get over the controls is just being more confident that the Pikmin would act in specific ways. One of the hardest things for me during any RTS is feeling confident that my troops will be smart enough to act in an intelligent way when running into something I didn't plan for. Due to the nature of real-time strategy, I have to keep my focus on multiple things at once, but it can be a bit of a struggle to take my eyes off of a fight or the construction of an important building or unit. In Pikmin, this problem is exacerbated by the fact that performing two tasks at the same time required me to spend a decent amount of time walking over to a different section of the map. I just wasn't always confident in my army to get things done for me. Yet, just like with Warcraft 3, I learned to trust them and have confidence in the Pikmin. It's interesting because I was afraid of losing Pikmin, but Pikmin can be regrown while the time I'm spending not doing things will never come back. Still, my brain thought it was a good idea to micromanage. While this may sound like it's something to do with strategy more than controls, I can tell you personally that I had assumed the game wanted a precision from me that was unreasonable to keep up at all times without falling into a pit of despair. The game never expects that much of the player, and is actually trying to help you as much as possible by having Pikmin act in extremely predictable ways. This made it easier to rely on the Pikmin to take the correct course of action every single time, which gave me the confidence to use the controls to their fullest ability. While the controls can be a bit of a stumbling block, especially because later Pikmin games fixed some of the issues with this one, I found myself still being able to get used to them and use them for my advantage. While it's easy to assume that the exploits are what carried the controls for me, it's more that they helped me learn more about the game and not judge it quite so harshly for having controls that were initially off-putting or strange. Eventually, I was controlling Pikmin well enough to perform decently well at collecting all the ship parts in the game. It just took a bit of getting used to. The worst feeling in any Pikmin game is when you lose out on a large group of Pikmin when fighting one of their many predators. This feeling is so bad that I distinctly remember stopping the game as a kid when I had lost a large group of Pikmin to a Bulborb. It's not like the developers made it any less distressing. You hear Pikmin cry, their ghosts float away, your population at the end of the day is diminished. It's not a fun experience. Pikmin will die though. Sometimes to a poor strategy, sometimes to the Pikmin AI, and sometimes they get stuck on a wall and the day ends and you just watch the life on the planet eat them. The whole experience can feel unfun. The game seems bent on ensuring you feel bad about every single Pikmin death, which makes it hard to enjoy the game when you feel like every mistake you make is shown to you in the most dramatic ways possible. This is in addition to what I mentioned before about Olimar being the camera. If I had sent some Pikmin to bring a ship part to my base but forgot just one or two enemies, I would start seeing the number of Pikmin dwindle while handling something else. This leads to the game's difficulty pushing me away as a new player. Eventually, though, I began to understand what they're going for in this game. Let's start with the enemies. Many of them have a ton of health and work with the environment to be as annoying as possible. This makes them a bit formidable when you first meet them. However, you eventually learn how to counter their attack strategies and make some of your own. The standard Bulborb is a good example. On first blush, the creature seems to be pretty aggressive, but they sleep during the day, so attacking them while they're sleeping is a good idea, and the quickest way to attach Pikmin to them is by swarming. You then easily come up with the idea of swarming them with Pikmin from behind. This goes for every enemy in the game. There's a frustration due to not knowing exactly how they work, but after trying a few different strategies, their weaknesses reveal themselves. This process of assessing enemies to properly handle them honestly reminds me of action games where you do something similar by observing enemy movesets until you gain the confidence to defeat them. It's a satisfying experience where, by the end, I felt like I had gained a powerful understanding of the environment and a strong command of the planet. The enemies being so hard actually made overcoming them feel even more satisfying and interesting. It's something that can only really happen if the game is throwing actually tough creatures at the player. It also helped that enemies don't immediately come back the next day. This way, the game feels like it was rewarding me for staying in a singular location for some time to clean up all the ship parts. The game expected me to always be exploring new areas because killing all the enemies led to an easier time getting to those new areas quickly. This made those enemies and losses to them feel a lot more justified considering how much I was able to clear out in a single day. This is on top of just getting a clearer idea of how easy it is to avoid enemies, even in the late game. There were often points where I felt comfortable just walking around an enemy rather than being on the attack the whole time. I only attacked if I knew I would be moving a lot in certain areas, rather than just killing enemies for the sake of it. This ultimately led me to losing fewer Pikmin, because I was more selective about which brawls I should or shouldn't get into based on what my goals were, rather than just because an enemy appeared to be in my way. This is obviously something I wouldn't have considered very deeply unless the enemies themselves were difficult and dangerous to fight. Their difficulty led to some interesting and sometimes risky strategy. I mentioned earlier that losing a lot of Pikmin feels terrible, almost to the point of restarting the whole day. However, as I continued to play the game, I understood that it's not that difficult to recover. Even in the endgame, I found that although enemies were getting harder, they were also rewarding me with more Pikmin if I decided to pick them up. This led to a nice loop where if I had lost a ton of Pikmin at once, I would send a few to pick up the corpse and take it back to the onion to regain the forces. It's also nice to go back to the impact site after the first day and gather more Pikmin that way. There are these pearly clamps who give a ton of extra Pikmin on top of all of the big pellets around. I'm usually comfortable with only about 70 of each Pikmin, but honestly I could probably get away with 50 of each type if I got a lot better. Given that I didn't need that many, it's very easy to gather up my forces in time for the final trial. The game provided me plenty of opportunities to gather extra Pikmin and have enough to complete the game without issue. No matter what, the game always gave me the tools to recover. While the difficulty may seem daunting, I ended up having a really good relationship with it over time. I felt myself grow into the role of Captain Olimar and get better at understanding and controlling my Pikmin. I also just learned a lot about how hostile the enemies can be in the game. Often they weren't actively hunting me down, so I was set up to sneak past them or use some risky strategies to distract them. By the end of the game, I wasn't even worried with how much time I had left or how many Pikmin were in my onions. The game just ended. While I've been talking a lot about what Pikmin does right with its systems to make itself less intimidating, I'd be foolish not to note the ways Pikmin fails sometimes at executing its ideas. Firstly, I want to talk about yellow Pikmin and how much I ended up loathing them by the end of all my playthroughs of the original game. While the game is only initially interested in their jump height, it quickly moves on to their ability to throw bomb rocks at certain barriers in the game. This is the only useful trait that yellow Pikmin have. There are perhaps 3 or 4 of the 30 ship parts which require the player to use the extra throw height, which means that yellow Pikmin are primarily focused on these bomb rocks. This is terrible because of how the original game chooses to handle controlling these dumb bomb rocks. Upon throwing a Pikmin with a bomb rock, whistling them will cause the Pikmin to drop the bomb rock and run toward Olimar. While this is somewhat useful in the final battle, it is absolutely terrible outside of it. Recalling any group of Pikmin which are too high for Olimar to reach means losing out on bombs. They're also extremely dangerous, so dropping a bomb in the wrong place or forgetting that the bomb Pikmin are thrown so they will drop the bombs upon whistling means a bunch of Pikmin get caught up in the explosion, and it's not fun. I'm glad that later games avoid this issue entirely by giving yellow Pikmin their resistance to electricity instead. However, that also comes at the cost of their utility. Yellow Pikmin were easily my least favorite type in the whole playthrough, and often felt more like a detriment to my group than an asset. Another thing that frustrated me is the lack of common sense with the Pikmin AI. There are many instances where you have to cross a very thin bridge built on top of water. Crossing this bridge should be as simple as walking through it. The red Pikmin won't jump into the water, right? Well, they will. Generally, Pikmin need to have their hand held through hazards, which leads to some unhealthy playstyles in my opinion. The forest navel is by far one of the most intensive areas for micromanagement because the amount of fire contrasted with the surplus of ship parts which require the other two types of Pikmin. This is an interesting dynamic, but the lack of fine-tuned controls on Pikmin outside of Olimar's vision means I just carried a bunch of red Pikmin with me in those instances. While this might have been interesting from a group management perspective, and on challenge runs I'd expect it to be, I had plenty of time and the ship parts weren't even heavy enough to require a lot of forethought on bringing a bunch of red Pikmin. If Pikmin were smarter with how they interacted with hazards like the fire geysers, it could be interesting to try and micromanage them to go fast, or have them take extra long if you brought the wrong type of Pikmin. Their intelligence is so low though that it's not even a consideration. One final thing I'll mention is that the game is just too short with too little to do. I know that it's basically a compliment to say I wanted more from the game, but it's true. Outside of getting faster at collecting all the ship parts and challenge mode, there's little to do after getting the happy ending. The biggest thing in my opinion is fighting the Smoky Prog, however that's something that seems not worth it to me at all, given how easy it is to restock your lost Pikmin. Obviously, there are more Pikmin games, so I'm sure there's more interesting variety in the later entries, but I really just want to get a ton more out of this one. Although I'll remind everyone that I also like how tight this game is, and as a result, it's extremely replayable for me. There's also the randomizer and some other community additions to the game that make this first adventure continuously fun. The first Pikmin has a lot of friction in it, which can feel pretty demoralizing at times. There's time limits, enemies, and only so many Pikmin you can pluck before, oops, it's time to run back to the ship. Yet, when I finally accepted that, I actually started to enjoy it. I realized that a lot of those aspects actually help the game remain engaging for its relatively short runtime. It also made me think of what I could do to overcome those parts of the game on repeat playthroughs. In other words, I enjoyed much of that friction I felt from Pikmin, even though I used to think it got in the way. Sure, I have my issues with this game and how it handles certain things, but the issues that this first game has aren't the intentional game design choices, but the weird limits of the engine and the time constraints on the game's development. At its core, Pikmin is a fantastic game, which is why I think more people ought to give it a shot. You too can overcome the time limit, controls, and difficulty that the first game presents. You might even end up loving some of that by the end. If you want to check out Pikmin, in the description I've linked the Nintendo eShop where you can pick up Pikmin 1 on Nintendo Switch. There's also Pikmin Squared, a fan-made remake of the first game in Pikmin 2's engine, which is really impressive. Both are linked below. Additionally, I want to shout out everyone who watched the last video on Fabula Ultima. I'm surprised by how well it did, so thank you. I also want to ask that if you like the channel and want to see more videos in the future, I'd recommend donating either through Patreon, Ko-Fi, or even through YouTube Supers and memberships. I don't have any exclusive content to give at this time, so it'd be purely a donation. No matter what though, thank you for watching.